Welcome back to the Racing House. My name is Sakki, and today we're going to be going over the F1 greatest of all time debate. Good. One that will never be settled. Never. In future, you could have a driver that goes into the double digits in terms of titles secured, and you'd still have a difference of opinion. There are so many different factors, which means that it's completely impossible to compare generations. Personally, when an F1 driver or an F1 legend speaks up, I listen. So rather than go over the same old statistics, let's go over what the big personalities in F1, the F1 legends, have to say and find out who they have chosen as the greatest of all time F1 driver. A big shout out to Jimmy Hyrola who inspired this video. He made an NBA version of this video. Keep an eye out to see which F1 driver will come out on top. The late great Murray Walker. Now this guy has seen it all. He's obviously commentated across multiple generations, and quite interestingly he gives quite a wild card response for his GOAT. He said, for me, the greatest of all time was a chap called Tazio Nuvolari, an Italian from before World War II. And when I mention his name, people look at me blankly. To be honest, I don't have a clue who he is, so I think he realised this and gave a more conventional answer. And when talking about Lewis Hamilton, he goes on to say, but he is also, in my opinion, and this is very contentious indeed, better than either Schumacher or Senna, because both of them, Schumacher and Senna, adopted at various times in their career highly debatable driving tactics. For example, Schumacher stopping deliberately in Monaco to prevent Alonso from getting pole position, like Schumacher colliding with Jacques Villeneuve at Jerez in 1997, like Senna with Alain Prost in 1990 in Japan. Lewis Hamilton has never been in anything like that. He's always driven as clean as a whistle. So that's a point to Lewis. Jackie Stewart. Jackie Stewart has been one to be very vocal about the difference in terms of technology when he drove, and in 2020 he went on to say that naming Lewis Hamilton as the GOAT would be difficult for him to justify. He then went on to rank his top three, placing Ayrton Senna in third place, placing Jim Clark in second place, and placing Fangio in first. So not even a mention of Michael Schumacher or Lewis Hamilton. Okay. But you can't really say anything because it's his own opinion. He's been there, done that, won multiple world championships. Fernando Alonso. Now, Fernando Alonso comes out with some interesting logic here. I remember Michael as a pilot who is hard to beat, one with the greatest talent. He had a little something. Lewis is very good and the best in his generation, but he didn't win the world championship with McLaren when he was a teammate with Jensen. Alonso also goes on to say, at Mercedes, Nico Rosberg also won the world championship. Michael never had such things. He also won. And Alonso finishes off by saying, for me, Michael is one step ahead. His vote goes to Michael Schumacher. Eddie Jordan, probably one of the most vocal wildcard personalities in the sport. And to be honest, I love the guy. He just comes out with some absolute clangers sometimes. In 2020, he came out and said that Alain Prost was the F1 GOAT. In 2021, he dismissed Ayrton Senna from the discussion purely because of the shortness of his career due to Ayrton passing away. And he actually came out and picked Lewis Hamilton as his F1 GOAT, stating that Lewis never won his titles in a collision like Michael in Adelaide in 1994. Lewis's time at Mercedes was never tarnished by rumours of cheating. I still remember how Michael suffered when Benetton were accused of using illegal traction control in 1994, and his time at Ferrari didn't quite go by without someone pointing a finger at the red team. But I also do feel like it's got something to do with the way that Michael managed to get out of his contract in his debut season with Jordan. Might have left a little bit of a sour taste in Jordan's mouth. So that's another one for Lewis. Ross Brawn. Now, this is where you sit up and you really listen, because he is a former team principal that has managed two of the top contenders for the F1 GOAT title. So you really do listen when he speaks. He goes on to say that Lewis is incredibly professional, dedicated and committed, but Michael had an intensity of detail towards the car that Lewis doesn't need. Michael was brought up in an era where there wasn't the technology that there is now. Data analysis was pretty crude. Driver involvement was much higher. As you get further into it, you start to realise, even though he doesn't give an answer, he does give an answer, mainly in this point. So the needs and the requirements of a driver are quite different. Michael had the intensity and involvement in the car that Lewis doesn't need to have, and he's saying that he can't really judge Lewis to the full extent that he's been able to assess Michael, because Lewis hasn't really needed to do certain things, read the car, feed that back to engineers, whereas he knows that Michael been amazing at it. So for me, this one goes to Michael. Sebastian Vettel. So in November 2020, the German four-time world champion had stated that his vote for the best ever driver goes to the driver that managed to unlock that kind of extra level. He also said, "I still say that Michael is the best of all time," which is no surprise as he was fairly close with Michael growing up in the sport and very close with his family even now. He is pretty much Vettel's idol. This one goes to Michael. And if you're enjoying this type of content, ensure that you make me your F1 YouTube GOAT by hitting that like button. Jacques Villeneuve. Now there were some confusing comments from Jacques. Think that he likes to be quite outspoken. He did say that Michael and Ayrton won in cars who shouldn't have won in complicated situations without the help of their teams. But he also then goes on to say, "I would rate Lewis above Michael by miles." And he then went on to double down on that statement by saying that Schumacher wouldn't even make it into his top 5, listing Hamilton, Senna, Prost, Lauda and Jackie Stewart as the best 5 drivers in that order. So that's a point to Lewis. Nico Rosberg. So the 2016 champion is in a very special position. He has been a teammate for 2 of the main GOAT contenders, Lewis Hamilton and Michael Schumacher. And in 2019, Nico tweeted that Lewis was on his way to becoming the GOAT after his number 6 title. However, in 2020, he also spoke about his time with Michael Schumacher, saying that he was just a complete all-rounder and for him, the best of all time, putting Senna, Hamilton and Prost behind him in that order. So that's another vote for Michael. Jenson Button. So Jenson Button, an F1 world champion, is a classic example of the approach taken by people nowadays, and he goes on to say you can't compare someone like Fangio with Lewis Hamilton. However, in April 2021, he did a throwback tweet where he said it's always very special racing with this guy, i.e. Michael Schumacher, #GOAT. So that's another one that goes to Michael. Damon Hill. So Damon Hill, speaking in late 2020, when asked about if Lewis Hamilton was the GOAT, kind of agreed, stating that he certainly is in terms of race wins. Michael was there for what we thought was all time and Fangio before him, but he still thinks statistically that Lewis is the GOAT. That's a point to Lewis. Christian Horner. Christian Horner is another team principal that has won multiple world championships leading a team, and what he said is quite interesting. It's obviously Lewis Hamilton. Okay, I'm joking. Let's be serious now. The one that has stood out for him, Ayrton Senna. There's something magical about Senna for him. Bernie Ecclestone. When it comes to the F1 GOAT debate, he puts Michael Schumacher ahead of Hamilton because Hamilton has God knows who to help explain to him tyre pressure or cornering speeds. But when it comes down to his final pick, surprisingly, he goes on to say Alain Prost. He goes on to say that he never got a lot of support from his team and that they didn't get that much help from the pit wall either. At one point for Alain Prost. Alain Prost. Keeping on topic, Alain Prost's response was quite interesting because he went on to admit that over 40 years he's been asked the same question and he's never fully answered it. He talks about Senna, Schumacher and Lewis Hamilton being the best of their generation, and then he kind of turns it round and flips the attention onto him, saying that undeniably though, I am underrated. He's gone down the route of not answering the question and just voted for himself. You're allowed to vote for yourself, so that's 1 point for Prost. David Coulthard. David Coulthard has a high profile role in the sport despite retiring many years ago. In February 2020, Coulthard mentioned that his fellow Brit was not quite at the level of Schumacher. In 2020, David Coulthard said, "I would like him, Lewis Hamilton, to break through. Records are there to be broken. However, it doesn't change anything in the history books if Hamilton does. We would certainly keep referring to Michael." By November 2020, things had changed. Hamilton had just won his 7th world title and this put him right next to Michael Schumacher. And Coulthard kind of backtracked and said that they were now on the same level. However, I'm going to give this point to Michael Schumacher because he did make that statement saying that the reference point would always be Michael, which we know that they do. Everyone does it. Flavio Briatore, the team principal that has multiple world championships under his belt. He's down on record as saying, "You need to recognise that when Michael arrived, the competition was tough. You're talking about Nigel Mansell, you're talking about Senna. From Hamilton again, nobody put pressure on him. You have 2 drivers, 3 drivers, the competition is less than before." So that is a clear signal that his vote goes to Michael Schumacher. Toto Wolff. He's been down on record and saying that one day he's going to stop his career with multiple records and people will say that he was the greatest driver on the planet and we were witnesses of that journey. So it's clear that Toto is going for Lewis here. Emerson Fittipaldi. It was quite hard to decipher what his choice was and he basically said that Lewis Hamilton is one of the greats but he should go to another team to prove how great he is. But the fact that he feels that Lewis needs to go to another team to prove himself even further despite matching Michael makes me feel that he probably thinks that Michael is the current GOAT in F1. So I'll give this point to Michael, the late great Niki Lauda, a former driver that has been there, done that. He's down on record in the past as saying that Lewis is the most complete driver on the grid. Lewis is now the greatest driver ever. Lewis is fast, focused, no mistakes, brilliant in the wet, nobody's better. And just rounding it all off, you can see that Michael Schumacher has got a clear lead with 8 votes in total versus Lewis Hamilton, who comes just closely behind him, getting 6 votes. So it is very close. We had Fangio on 1 vote, we had Senna on 1 vote as well, and then Prost coming up in 3rd place with 2 votes. These thoughts on who's the greatest of all time is just going to constantly change. There'll be new drivers that come along, maybe drivers who are already on the grid that will come and completely smash these records, or maybe just match them, which will make you rethink who the greatest of all time actually is. They're not static. And doing the research for this video, I saw this time and time again, someone giving an initial opinion, a couple years later changing it to someone completely else. And we know that there are certain drivers that are constantly breaking these records and edging further to going clear and going even further in terms of creating their own records. So those are just a few examples where people have come out and said, this person is the F1 GOAT, that person's the best. But it really does show you that people approach it differently. We've seen people take it from a statistical point of view. It's all about numbers, clear black and white differences, which would put Lewis out in front. But also people take it in the view that what impact has this driver had? How does this driver make people feel? So for example, Senna, despite not being statistically the greatest, he's just evoked such a feeling from people. Those memories coming through, the smile that he has, the way that he makes people feel, the kindness that came from Senna, always having time to speak to people. That's a message that you always heard time and time again. It really does put him at the forefront. And then Michael Schumacher, he was effectively the first GOAT in a modern era, where he went on to smash Fangio's records and set records that we never thought would be broken. Obviously Lewis has come on to do that and break those records and extend them even further. So Michael sits there for a lot of people, especially the more modern generation. Then there's drivers like Fangio, who will always be there. Jim Clark will always be there because of the older generation see them as being able to do a little bit more, have more involvement than the modern driver, because they just didn't have that support structure where they would have engineers feeding them data and information, the analysis almost instantly. We've heard that pop up time and time again. The varying thoughts across the spectrum make you realize that it's not just about the driver, it's about the support network that comes with it, the information, the physicality involved. It's far less physical now than it was, which all play a part in the way that people think. So that older generation tend to know how hard it was in terms of handling those cars. It doesn't mean that it's not hard to manage those cars now and drive them, but it does play a factor in terms of the way people look at the F1 GOAT debate. So I really do hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Which comments and thoughts really stood out for you in this video? Do you massively disagree with any of the comments from these F1 legends and big personalities in the sport? I really do hope you've enjoyed this one. Until next time everyone, thanks for watching. Like, subscribe and hit that notification bell to ensure that you get all my latest videos.